Today's episode is brought to you by KiwiCo, creator of super cool hands-on projects for kids that make learning about science, technology, engineering, art, and math fun. Kids can make their own arcade games, a hydraulic claw, tinker with motors, and so much more. Right now, KiwiCo is offering Fictional listeners the chance to try them for free. To redeem this offer and learn more about projects for kids, visit kiwico.com/fictional. Well, now I want more, Carissa demanded. I already gave you a set amount. That's not how extortion works, Benedetto whispered. Any louder and the servants would hear. That's exactly how extortion works, the faux retired baker retorted, adding that next week, the fee for his silence would be double. Benedetto buried his face in his hands, and then struggled to say that he didn't have it. Carissa shrugged. Bummer. Well, he had until Monday to scrounge up the money or else. Carissa wondered if Monte Cristo would like a letter about Benedetto's past. He could never remember, did Monte Cristo have an H in it or not? Then, Benedetto lighted on an idea. Maybe he could solve one problem with another. He shot up a finger. Monte Cristo. He knew where Carissa could get all the money. He could rob Monte Cristo. Benedetto rolled out some paper and drew a not at all accurate map of Monte Cristo's house, one to which he stated he visited dozens of times. Moreover, he shared that Monte Cristo was his real father. Carissa cocked an eyebrow. When did that happen? It was obvious, Benedetto insisted. The man couldn't outright claim him, but he had brought him to Paris and set him up with that fake dad. Regardless, Benedetto knew exactly where the Count kept a few million in banknotes. If Carissa wanted to, ensure Benedetto's inheritance, wink, wink. You mean stab the Count? Sure. And why'd you say wink, wink? Benedetto rolled his eyes and laid out a plan. They would go tomorrow. Carissa nodded, a dark smile spreading across his face. He ducked into the shadows and left. Benedetto waited until he disappeared completely. Then he went swiftly to his desk to write a letter of warning to the Count of Monte Cristo. I'm Jason Weiser. From Bardic, this is Fictional. Carissa lined up the knife at the man's chest and stabbed until his arms grew tired. You done? Father Busoni asked, as the chainmail he wore underneath his habit blunted the knife. With one motion, he gripped Carissa's wrist, twisted it, and dislocated his shoulder. Outside, Benedetto heard the scream. This was going well. At the very least, his Carissa problem would be solved. He had warned the Count of the impending robbery, and instead of contacting the police, Monte Cristo had instead moved the entire household to the country estate for the night. Save Ali and donned the garb of Father Busoni the moment he saw Carissa. Carissa had been shocked, of course, but not shocked enough to not stab the very man who helped him all those years ago by gifting him that large diamond. Benedetto only heard the scream, not what followed. Carissa had screamed, but then he sang. He told the fake priest everything, and, in exchange for his life, Busoni made him sign a statement, saying that Andrea Cavalcanti was Benedetto. Then, Busoni handed him another stack of banknotes. The father directed him to the window. If Carissa made it home alive, he could keep the money on the condition that he went far away and never returned. You see, if Carissa survived the trip home, Busoni would be convinced that God wanted him alive. Carissa wasted no time. He snatched the money, thanked the priest, and started his descent from the second story with his one good arm. Monte Cristo sighed heavily. He hadn't expected Carissa. Not here. He thought the man was still languishing in prison for helping his wife murder that jeweler. He sighed again. The Carissa he knew in Marseille wasn't deserving of death. That's why Edmund gave him the second chance and left it in God's hands. A loud thump by the front door told him that God had answered. Ali opened the door to the silhouette of Carissa, who immediately fell flat on his face, a knife protruding from his back. Monte Cristo shook his head and told Ali to get him up. They didn't have much time. The Count placed a single drop of red potion on Catarossa's lips. Then another. Nothing. Monte Cristo bit his lip and dropped yet another. At last, Catarossa gasped awake. Benedetto. He said it was Benedetto who stabbed him and stole the money. I know. Edmund, disguised as Monte Cristo, disguised as Busoni, said with a hand outstretched. Sign this. It was another sheet that said exactly that. A sworn statement that Benedetto had murdered Catarossa. Catarossa signed it and laid back. I believe in God, Busoni said, and I believe he will be merciful to you. Catarossa groaned and lost consciousness. Edmund wasn't going to let him leave. Not yet. He dropped more of the potion. You're here. Of all the people Benedetto could have been chained next to, it was you. That shows me that I'm right. That God is with me, Monte Cristo said, as he took off the beard and eyebrows. Catarossa looked on the man changing his appearance before him. Busoni was Monte Cristo? But the man didn't stop there. Catarossa heard that if he confessed his sins, Monte Cristo was convinced that God would be merciful. Except that it wasn't in the booming, stately voice of the Count, but in the soft, kind voice of someone Catarossa had known long ago. Edmund? Edmund? Catarossa gasped, the first man to look on the undisguised face of Edmond Dantes in years. Catarossa began to weep. He told Edmund he was so sorry. It was a joke. At least that's what Danglars had said. He was drunk, but that was no reason to do what they did. It was inexcusable. He begged Edmund's forgiveness. That's when things started to go wrong for him. That was when his life truly took a turn for the worse. And he was so sorry. Edmund looked down at his old landlord and rested his hand on the man's chest. I forgive you. He was beyond the help of any of Edmund's potions, and after a minute of gasping and convulsions, Catarossa died. Edmund closed the eyes of his former landlord and friend and looked up. The pity washed from his eyes. 1. The news of the break-in and murder at Monte Cristo's house, scandalous though it was not even the biggest news story of the week. A man in the government, a rich count, now known throughout France as Fernand Mondego, was on trial for treason. His first name was published in the paper, and the city went wild with speculation. Then, a man from Greece came bearing a stack of papers, all signed documents, saying that Fernand Mondego, now known as the Count de Morcerf, had betrayed Ali Pasha, the local king, to the Turks, murdered him, and sold his wife and daughter into slavery. He might have gotten away with it too. Sure, they had signed statements, but those were from half a world away, and they could mean anything. It happened years ago, and Fernand testified that he fought valiantly for his king's defense, but the city still fell. No one in France could corroborate any story, so the chamber moved to acquit Mondego of the charges. But there was someone still alive. Mondego learned this when Haiti, accompanied by Bertuccio, pushed open the doors of the court. Instantly, Mondego froze, and then he started to tremble at the sight of Haiti. Before the court could ask, Haiti set down 3 items on the table before the judge: her birth certificate, her baptismal record, and, most importantly, the record of the sale of her person. The one who had sold her, well, he was greedy. He wanted to squeeze every last coin out of the transaction. So it was thorough. He probably never intended to go into government, and certainly never intended to be in the same city as Haiti ever again, or else he wouldn't have put his own name down on the record. She slid the bill of sale across to the judge and pointed at the name. All her previous owners were there. Monte Cristo, the Sultan before him, and there at the top was Fernand Mondego, his signature being the largest and most prominent. Haiti said that she was happy to provide her testimony too. Contrary to what the chamber heard, he did not fight valiantly. He actually didn't fight at all. Instead, he murdered her father and surrendered the city, all in the name of France. She said that she was in the employ of the Count of Monte Cristo now, but when she read Mondego's name in the paper, she had to act. The court asked if she was sure. Haiti turned to Mondego. You didn't forget the man who betrayed you, sold you, and raised your father's head on a spear, she said. She was sure. With that, she left. She didn't need to wait to see what verdict was handed down. She had avenged her father. Felony, treason, removal from office. Those were the things Fernand Mondego's son, Albert, had heard mere minutes after the trial had ended from his friends in the government who had been there. He had been following the trail closely and learned it was Baron Danglars who wrote the piece in the paper and paid for the information from Greece. And so he went to challenge the Baron to a duel, or, if he was too scared, the man who replaced Albert as Eugenie's betrothed, Andrea Cavalcanti. Danglars immediately caved under fear and told Albert that he had the wrong guy. Danglars said he had only been looking out for his own interests, learning about the family he was going to yoke his own to through marriage. No, the guy Albert really wanted was the man who gave Danglars the idea, the Count of Monte Cristo. It was then that it all had fit into place. Monte Cristo not only brought Haiti here with all the requisite proof to convict his father and told Albert the story, knowing full well what he was going to do, but then he planted the idea in Danglars' head to make him do it. Albert shook his head. Monte Cristo refused to eat in his father's house. Monte Cristo was the enemy. And so, Danglars rushed to the opera, where Monte Cristo was sitting with Maximilien Morel. He threw down his glove and challenged Monte Cristo to a duel. Edmund, you will not kill my son. Monte Cristo, the disguised Edmund, heard from the shadows of the garden. Who are you talking to? He replied. Edmond Dantes, Mercedes said, stepping into the dim light and lowering her hood. Monte Cristo looked away. Edmond Dantes is dead. He died trying to escape Chateau d'If after 14 years in the dark. Mercedes asked why then he was coming after Albert and Fernand. Why was he dredging up skeletons from her husband's past and dueling her son? When it was her fault. She was alone. She had been weak, and she had found small comfort in Fernand's arms. She thought Edmund was dead. They told her he was dead. And why were you alone? Edmund asked. Mercedes didn't understand. It was because Edmund was in prison. He was carrying a letter from the Emperor or something. Edmund calmly pulled a letter from his coat. He thanked God she hadn't known. He pressed the letter into her hand and waited for her to read it. It was written by Danglars and mailed by Fernand Mondego the day before Edmond Dantes and Mercedes were set to marry. He spent 14 years in Chateau d'If, less than 2 miles away from her, because of that letter. He lost the woman he loved because of that letter. His father starved to death because of that letter. That was why he was doing what he was doing. That was why he was in Paris. And that was why Albert had to die, so Fernand could feel some fraction of the pain Edmund felt before Edmund decided that it was time for him to go too. Mercedes looked deeply into Edmund's eyes. And what of her? Edmund had thought about Mercedes every day in Chateau d'If, guessing which side of the prison he was on so he could lean to the wall closest to her, praying constantly that she was out there, somewhere, thinking of him. Then, after he escaped, he learned that she had married Fernand Mondego, the man who had sent him to prison in the first place. Edmund paused. He didn't know what else to say. He loved her. He would always love her. But he had been deeply hurt. It turned out that Edmund had died in Chateau d'If. Who he used to be died down there in the dark. And in the intervening decades, he'd become a corpse, animated only by revenge. And now, he was going to give it all up. The man I love will kill my son, Mercedes said with a sob. Edmund closed his eyes and exhaled. Danglars and Villefort would go free, but maybe there was more than revenge. He faced Mercedes. Her son would live. He would not kill Albert in the duel tomorrow. Mercedes flew to him and embraced him. She thanked God that he was the man she always dreamed he was. the man she always loved. He sighed. At least he wouldn't have to live long with this conflict. Edmund did not have long to be loved by Mercedes. Tomorrow, he was going to die. Mercedes cast her eyes to the ground and breathed heavily. She thought he might insist on that. She thanked him for being willing to sacrifice himself and his goals for her and her son. She held his hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had nothing more to ask of God. She had seen Edmund again and found him as noble and as great as she remembered him. Edmund smiled sadly, and Mercedes left the garden. Weary, he shuffled inside. Somewhere, off in the house, there was weeping. He followed the sound and discovered Haiti collapsed on a couch. She had just learned of the duel. She begged his forgiveness if going to the courts without him knowing had led to the duel. But as he embraced her, he told her that there was so much more to it than that. Don't worry. She would be taken care of. But Haiti didn't care about that. All she wanted was him, alive, with her. As he held her, Edmund laughed. On the night before his death, he discovered it. He might have been happy after all. He was in love with Haiti. Early the next morning, Monte Cristo stood on the field, awkwardly facing all the young men he had met at breakfast on his first morning in Paris. Monte Cristo inspected the pistols he had brought and squinted into the rising sun. On the last day he would live. He wouldn't see his vengeance through, but maybe he had done enough. He had certainly done more than he ever dreamed he could in the darkest nights in Chateau d'If. It would have to be enough. Alone and late, Albert crested the hill on his horse. Without making eye contact with Monte Cristo, he talked to his second, a journalist friend, who came over and spoke to Maximilien Morel. Monte Cristo's second, the man gasped and turned to Monte Cristo. Albert had something to say. The young man turned to Monte Cristo and then faced all of his friends. He wouldn't be dueling Monte Cristo today. He'd started this because he felt as if Monte Cristo had engineered his father's downfall. But in the past 12 hours, he had learned two things. One, Monte Cristo had engineered his father's downfall. And two, he had a good reason for doing so. Now, the only thing he had to say to Monte Cristo was thank you. Thank you for being so kind to both Albert and his mother. It was far better than his father deserved for what he did to a young man all those years ago. Hiding his surprise, Monte Cristo nodded and accepted. The young man in attendance watched, stunned, as Albert mounted his horse and rode back toward Paris, leaving Monte Cristo standing in awe of Mercedes' son. Why did my son return a coward? Fernand Mondego boomed to Monte Cristo from the doorway. Albert was not a coward, Monte Cristo corrected, sipping tea and standing to greet the uninvited guest. He asked Haiti, who was still beaming in the afterglow of Monte Cristo's return, if she would give him some privacy to speak. He had something he needed to take care of here. Fernand had wondered how Albert could have returned. He left for a duel, and he came back neither victorious nor dead. Word was beginning to trickle out from Albert's group of friends that Albert, instead of seeing his demand for satisfaction through, had apologized to Monte Cristo, and apologized on behalf of his father. Fernand didn't know who Monte Cristo was or why the man had it out for him, but he had to finish what Albert had started. But before, he demanded to know who Monte Cristo was and what his endgame was. What was Monte Cristo's name anyway? He went by Monte Cristo in France, Sinbad the Sailor in Italy, and a dozen other names in a dozen other countries. Yeah, Fernand had looked into it, and now Fernand wanted to know his real name, so he could say it as he buried a sword in Monte Cristo's heart. Calmly, Monte Cristo finished his tea without so much as looking up, and then he stood. Another duel, then? Absolutely. He just needed a moment to change. Minutes later, he returned, and Fernand looked up from the floor, turning almost as pale as Monte Cristo, as he looked on the man no longer clothed in the highest of Parisian fashion, but wearing the simple garb of a sailor. "Fernand," cried Monte Cristo, "of my 100 names, I need only one to tell you, but you guess it now, do you not? Or rather, you remember it. For notwithstanding all my sorrows and my tortures, I show you today a face which the happiness of revenge makes young again. A face you must have seen in your dreams since you married her, Mercedes, the woman I loved." Fernand staggered backwards, as though he had seen a ghost. He whispered that name, half in disbelief and half in terror. Edmond Dantes. Nearly tripping, he turned around and ran to his carriage, screaming "Home! Home!" to his driver, before throwing himself in the back of it. Fernand rode, daring to look back at Monte Cristo, who had stepped from his house, smiling, still wearing the clothes he had been wearing on the day he was set to marry Mercedes. Fernand couldn't steady his hand, and the only thing to rouse him from the surprise that Edmond survived was the carriage leaving his own house. Fernand jumped out and stopped the carriage, gripping the door. In the back were trunks and suitcases. In the front sat Mercedes and Albert. They didn't meet his eyes. Mercedes said, simply, that Albert shouldn't look back. It wasn't their home anymore. There wasn't anything left for them there. They were leaving and never coming back. Fernand let go of the carriage, scrambling to convince Mercedes to stay, but she ignored him. Still without looking down, Mercedes commanded the driver onward. Fernand stood in the wake of dust, a tear falling from his eye. He left his own carriage driver and walked to his house. It would be empty when he arrived. He was a traitor. He had no money, no office, no wife, and no heir. In the days to come, his title, which he had traded in exchange for his soul, would be taken from him as well. Edmond Dantes had taken everything. He would be nothing. He was nothing. Fernand's house was so big, and the man so alone, that no one heard the shot ring out. And no one discovered the body of Fernand Mondego until his servants arrived the following morning. Meanwhile, Monte Cristo had another visitor the moment Fernand left. He barely had a chance to change and tell Haiti that it was okay when Maximilien Morel, the son of Edmond Dantès' former employer, didn't so much as knock, but plowed in the door. He was in love with Valentine Villefort. Surprised, Monte Cristo tried to hide his disgust. "Seriously? Okay, so what?" Maximilien explained that she was dying. There was a lot of backstory, like if it was in a book, it would be like 100 pages of backstory. Monte Cristo asked if he could knock it out in like a paragraph, and Maximilien nodded. He had fallen in love with Valentine Villefort, the daughter of Monsieur de Villefort and his first wife. They had actually been meeting in Villefort's garden for months, with so much exhausting dialogue about how much they loved each other. Nordier had now been allowing them to meet inside. It was 3 months ago that Valentine's grandparents died, and Maximilien had been slipping out through the garden, where he overheard Villefort and the doctor. They suspected a poisoner lurked in the Villefort house. There had been 2 more victims since. Nordier's longtime servant had died when he drank some lemonade set out for Valentine. And then, just this morning, Valentine had fallen ill. Monte Cristo groaned. "And you love her? Her? Really?" Maximilien nodded vigorously. Monte Cristo rolled his eyes. "All right, go home. What is it, 10? If she's not dead by noon, she'll live." Maximilien furrowed his brow. Monte Cristo wasn't a god. What was he talking about? "You came to me for my help, and you'll have it. Go home and get some rest, and I'll send you news when I have it. And before you open your mouth, know that I don't want to change my mind, but I will. The only reason I would ever help that family is because you came to me. Now it's lurking in unexpected places and looks to impact our daily lives and what happens when women lean in and start driving change. Tilted is hosted by lean-in co-founder and president, Rachel Thomas, and it features intimate conversations with some of the world's most powerful women in Hollywood, politics, sports, and business. You'll hear a range of stories. And it's a really interesting listen. From Sheryl Sandberg helping answer questions from men, to Eva Longoria taking you onto the set of her new TV show to talk about the wave of women taking the lead in Hollywood. There's also Politicos discussing the likability penalty and how it'll affect the women candidates running for office this year in unprecedented numbers. So check it out. Listen and subscribe to Tilted from Lean In on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts, and explore each episode in depth at leanin.org. Today's episode is brought to you by Bombas. And it's official. I've replaced all my socks with Bombas. I have no shows for summer, dress socks for nice occasions, and athletic socks for the one time I went running. And yeah, sure, they are super soft cotton, they stay in place all day, they have an arch support with a cushioned footbed without the bulk, and all that other stuff that sets them apart from every other sock in the world. But what you'll really care about is that it feels like an all-day foot massage, or the best little tiny hug for your feet. They're these ultra-comfortable, you'll actually care about your socks type socks. Trust me. If you're a jogger, a fast walker, a power lounger, grocery shopper, podcast maker, office worker person, or anyone in between, there's a sock style and design for you. Thanks to 2 years of research and development, Bombas are the most comfortable socks in the history of feet. To see what Bombas socks can do to your life, go to bombas.com/fictional and use the code FICTIONAL for 20% off your first order. That's BOMBAS, bombas.com/fictional, code FICTIONAL, and you get 20% off your first order. All right, now back to the show. Nearly a week later, on the day of his daughter's wedding, Danglars finally felt like he could breathe again. The past 3 months had been bad, but he had a plan involving railroad speculation, and it would earn him 10 times his investment, if he had the money to invest. He couldn't go to others in Paris, and his recent misfortune was so well known that other houses were wary to lend to him abroad. All that was going to change, however, when Eugenie, his daughter, married Prince Andrea Cavalcanti, a kid with $3 million to his name and an aging father with triple that amount. The association alone was enough to get Danglars a loan from any bank in Europe. He had everyone who was anyone in his salon for the signing of the marriage contract. To counteract the rumors, he had all his best pieces, his art, jewels, and sculptures placed in the entryway to show just how much money the House of Danglars still possessed. Everyone was there. Everyone, save the Villaforts. But, not having your wife's ex-lover over was always kind of a perk. Apparently some work kept the king's attorney at home. Even still, today was a great day. Danglars smiled as he watched his wife and the Count of Monte Cristo standing before the table. She and Danglars would be signing on behalf of their daughter. And since Major Cavalcanti had gone back to Italy, / had been sent away over the liability of his inability to memorize a simple backstory, Monte Cristo was tasked with signing on behalf of Major Cavalcanti. So why was Villefort unable to make it? Madame Danglars asked as the attorney prepared the contract. Monte Cristo had alluded to being responsible when he came in. The Count grimaced. He asked if she remembered how that guy broke into his house and died in the arms of Father Busoni. Well, when the police came, they stripped off his outer coat and tossed it into a corner. Monte Cristo's house was so ridiculously large that when he returned to it this afternoon, he discovered the cloak. Since it was evidence, he took it to Villefort. Monte Cristo looked in the direction of Andrea Cavalcanti as he said the next words. The Count had watched Villefort go through the pockets, and he found a letter inside. He read it, gasped, and immediately told Monte Cristo he had to go. He apologized, but said he wouldn't be able to make it to Eugenie Danglars' wedding. Monte Cristo looked back, and Andrea Cavalcanti was gone. He managed a slight smirk. The young man was smart, at least. Just then, there was a murmuring at the door, then gasps, then a yell. Soldiers marched in with Villefort at the head. It turned out he had made it to the wedding after all. Villefort came bearing a letter, an order from the king, for the arrest of the man known as Benedetto, a murderer who went by the name of Andrea Cavalcanti. At the news, Madame Danglars fainted. Baron Danglars had to sit down, and Benedetto? Well, Benedetto was jumping out the window after stuffing everything of value he could manage from Baron Danglars' salon in his coat. At night, Valentine had started seeing shadows moving in her room. She had only caught bits and pieces of the past few days, but remembered drinking a bitter drink, and then collapsing, and then there was the twilight sleep. She would call out, but no one would answer. As the days passed, she woke more and more, until she saw the ghosts at night, shadows that danced on the edge of her vision, telling her that she wasn't better yet. This wasn't real. It was back again tonight, the shadow that slunk across the room. She needed her medicine. She reached out for the vial, when the shadow grabbed her and put a hand over her mouth. He told her to calm down. He wasn't trying to kill her, but someone was, and they were coming. Valentine calmed down and... Wait, Monte Cristo? She had only seen him a couple of times, but his face was so pale it nearly glowed in the candlelight. It was unmistakably him. He said there wasn't much time. He had built a secret compartment behind the bookshelf and hadn't slept in 4 days since the almost wedding of Eugenie Danglars. He was doing this as a favor to Maximilian. Someone was poisoning people in this house, and Valentine was supposed to be next. The only reason she wasn't dead was because Nordier had been giving her his medicine. His medicine contained brucine, which I guess in small doses helped stroke victims, but in larger doses, it proved lethal. He had built up a tolerance to it, and when his servant was poisoned, he had actually been the intended target. He was now giving Valentine that same gift, and oh, okay, they were coming. Valentine was confused. This was a lot to take in. Who was coming? Monte Cristo whispered into Valentine's ear. The poisoner was. Take a good look. That person comes into your room every night and tries to give you enough to finally kill you. The only reason she hasn't been able to is me. She? Valentine asked, but Monte Cristo was already sliding the bookshelf door aside. Valentine heard a noise at the door. Her? Valentine questioned when the poisoner left. Why would her stepmother want her dead? I know, tropey, right? Like, why don't we have a big bad wolf, too? Monte Cristo shrugged. But yeah, it's for her kid, Edward. She killed Valentine's grandparents, and then they made Valentine their heir. Nordier wasn't long for this world even without the poisoning, and, with Valentine gone, her estate would revert to Monsieur de Villefort. Then, it was only one more bitter drink, until Edward had everything. The wealth of 2 great families. Now, he needed Valentine to do 2 things. 1, don't drink that, don't do that at all. And 2, trust him. In the name of Maximilian, she needed to trust him, because even if she fled the country, she would never be safe. Madame de Villefort would find her. She needed to trust Monte Cristo and know that he was always watching over her, for Maximilian's sake. Even if she woke up in a tomb, she needed to trust him. Valentine sighed. If Maximilian trusted him, she could too. She nodded, and the Count handed her a pill. It would be a long road from here, but she made the right decision. Take that, and it would all begin. As she swallowed the pill, Monte Cristo emptied half the flagon of poison out into the fireplace and turned back to Valentine going to sleep. Good. It was already taking effect, which meant he could get a few hours of sleep in before meeting with his banker. Monte Cristo exited behind the bookshelf and down through the tunnel his workers had hastily constructed into the basement of the house owned by Father Busoni. Back in Villefort's house, in the light of the rising sun, Valentine Villefort lay motionless, a look of peace frozen on her face. Valentine Villefort had died. $5 million, Danglars laid out with pride. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It was entrusted to me by the hospitals. No big deal, just a lot of sick people's lives in my hands, Danglars said to Monte Cristo. Of course, he declined to mention that the $5 million had been deposited with him weeks ago, and that they were withdrawing today. But that didn't mean he couldn't bedazzle his biggest client, the Count of Monte Unlimited Credit Cristo. Monte Cristo inspected the banknotes as he congratulated Danglars that they had apprehended Andrea Benedetto, before he crossed the border to Belgium. Danglars grimaced. He would be happy to never hear either of those names again. Monte Cristo asked about Eugenie. But Danglars only shook his head. After the scandal, she went to a convent in Italy. She would be taking her vows next week. Of course, she wasn't really. Danglars had no idea where she was. He certainly didn't know that she had escaped with her piano teacher on the night of her wedding and was now living as an artist in Brussels. Monte Cristo smiled. He was happy everything worked out for Danglars. Yeah, wait, what are you doing? Monte Cristo had finished folding the last of the $1 million banknotes before tucking them into his pocket. He said he was withdrawing money from his bank. He had unlimited credit, right? Baron Danglars was speechless. This money belonged to the hospitals, and they were scheduled to withdraw it right after Monte Cristo's visit. He didn't have the money to pay both. Is this okay? Monte Cristo asked. $5 million was a lot of money. He was giving Danglars an out, but the man's pride stopped him from speaking up. Of course it was okay. Please, House Danglars could spare it. Monte Cristo shook his head in astonishment and wrote out the sum of $6 million, payable to the bearer by Thompson & French in Rome. Monte Cristo said he wasn't staying in Paris a year, as he thought, but instead he was leaving in a few days. So this concluded their business. But he would be happy to tell everyone that the House of Danglars in Paris was happy to lend out $5 million at a moment's notice. Also, real quickly, I got my accounting wrong on the first episode of the current series. Monte Cristo only borrowed a few $100,000 on the first day, when he met Danglars, and then a few more here and there. He asked Danglars to allot $6 million total, so that's why he could go and demand all the money on this day. So Danglars and Monte Cristo shook hands, and the Count left the Baron, just as the representative from the hospitals arrived to withdraw his $5 million. Danglars gestured to the man who had just left, saying that guy was the Count of Monte Cristo. Danglars had forgotten that the man from the hospital was coming by today, so he couldn't withdraw another $5 million. When the bank opened the next morning, he would personally deliver the banknotes. He hoped that was sufficient. The man from the hospital smiled. For a house like Danglars, of course. With a sneer, Danglars watched the representative leave. He walked back to his office and ran his fingers along his desk. It had been a good run. He had been the most respected banker in Paris, and tomorrow, all that would change. Luckily, for Danglars at least, he wouldn't be around to see it. He had a note for $6 million from Thompson & French and a 24-hour head start. He scribbled out a quick note saying goodbye forever to his wife, grabbed a hat and coat, and ducked off into the street. Oops, Monte Cristo said as he smashed the window to Maximilian Morel's room. Maximilian's sister and brother-in-law called out from downstairs. Was everything okay? Monte Cristo yelled back that it was. He just slipped on their polished stairs. He turned to Maximilian Morel. Hey, Maximilian, do you always write letters with a loaded gun next to you? Monte Cristo had been watching Maximilian since the death of Valentine, and he had seen the sighs and the forlorn glances on the horizon. He knew Maximilian was going to do something stupid. That was now confirmed. He told Maximilian that he wasn't allowed to end his life. Not today. Maximilian glared at Monte Cristo. Where did the Count get off telling Maximilian anything? He promised to save Valentine, and now she was dead. Why did he think he had any right to tell Maximilian he couldn't take his own life? Because I kept your father from taking his, Monte Cristo replied. Maximilian was confused. Because the old man was right. You all thought he was superstitious or maybe a little crazy, but he wasn't. He saw me on deck that day, looking out at Marseille. I am Edmond Dantes. Maximilian couldn't believe it, but Monte Cristo continued. He said he knew Maximilian's sorrow. He had lost a woman he loved, and if, when he was in the blackest darkness of Chateau d'If, you would have told him it got better, he would have laughed in your face. But it did. He didn't ask Maximilian to believe him, only to wait and hope. It would get better. Edmond asked for 3 weeks. He wanted Maximilian to travel with him to Marseille, and in 3 weeks' time, if he still wanted to, Edmond would supply the poison himself. Maximilian agreed. He could give Edmond that much. Excellent, Edmond smiled. They were leaving Paris tomorrow. There was just one more thing left to do, though. The trial. Villefort's eyes were bloodshot, both from lack of sleep and the tears. He had made a promise to himself that when the poisoner was discovered, he would bring them to justice himself. Just a few days prior, Nordier, Villefort's father, revealed that he knew. It was Madame de Villefort. Villefort's own wife had killed his daughter. His honor, power, and reputation demanded that he bring the poisoner to justice. He just had no idea that it would be his own wife. That morning, as she got ready to go to the trial, he confronted her, telling her that he would spare her the shame of an arrest and trial, but only if she took the poison she used on Valentine, poured it in a drink, and drank it herself. He left her standing there, speechless. Now, he was prosecuting one of the most famous cases of his career. This Benedetto guy, a common thief who had arrived on the Parisian scene and tricked Danglars to the extent that he almost joined the man's family. He had murdered a man and then fled the city. He was still wearing the clothes that he had worn to his wedding. It was all the people had been talking about for a week. And Villefort was the attorney who was going to bring him down. "Your age?" Villefort's co-counsel asked. 21, or I'm going to be 21 soon. I was born September 27th, 1817, in Auteuil, Benedetto said, his eyes lingering on Villefort, who looked up as soon as he heard the date. "And what's your name?" Benedetto replied that he didn't know his name. His birth parents had never given him one, but he did know his father. Villefort froze. He had no idea that Benedetto had a visitor in prison. Someone he knew quite well. His adoptive father, Bertuccio, who told him that the case against him was a bad one, but he had some information that could change all that. He told Benedetto about his birth. He told Benedetto everything. "Monsieur de Villefort," Benedetto yelled, pointing to the king's attorney. Everyone in the court cried out, save Villefort, who staggered to his seat as if he had been shot. After Villefort's colleague calmed the court down, he demanded an explanation for Benedetto disturbing the court. Benedetto shrugged. He didn't know he was disturbing the court. The court asked his birthday, he gave it. They asked his name, he gave it to the best of his ability. They asked who his father was, and he told them that too. A man, a Corsican, had sworn revenge on Villefort and stabbed him in the garden as he was burying something. Thinking it was treasure, he stole the box. But upon learning that it was a child, he raised it. That child was him. The couple named him Benedetto. Benedetto turned to face Villefort, who looked like he was going to be sick. "Right? Dad? I hope you have some proof, or this is slander," the deputy prosecutor barked. But Villefort stood. Benedetto didn't need proof. He was telling the truth. The attorney stepped back from his boss, looking on him with disgust. Who buries a live child in the garden? Villefort pushed past him and rushed out to his carriage. The attorney looked at the judge and threw up his hands in confusion. They were going to need some time to sort all this out. In the meantime, the soldiers needed to follow Villefort home. There would be questions. He had just admitted to infanticide in a court of law. Villefort shook as the carriage thundered toward his home. He had minutes to grab as much money, get Edward and his wife, and flee Oh no, no, Villefort said to himself, as he remembered the command that he gave his wife before leaving the house. He leapt from the carriage before it even came to a stop and stumbled inside. He screamed his wife's name, telling her to stop. He forgave her, to please not. But as he burst through the door, he saw that he was already too late. He was far too late. There, pale and already turning gray, was the body of Madame de Villefort. But there was another. In her arms, laying as if asleep, was Edward, her son. She couldn't live without him, and made sure he didn't live without her. The room started closing in, but Villefort forced himself to climb the stairs. He had to tell his father, Nordier. His father was all he had left in the world, and you? What are you doing here? Father Busoni knelt over Nordier, talking to him. The old priest smiled and began to pull away his beard and eyebrows. Monte Cristo? Villefort managed, but Monte Cristo shook his head as he took off more of the disguises. No, before that. He remembered this voice. He remembered Marseille, If he didn't remember sending a child away to die in prison for nothing, then Villefort was truly more evil than he ever thought possible. Edmond Dantes. Edmond smiled. Yes. His eyes flashed as he knelt down to look in the face of the king's attorney, on his knees on the floor. Edmond had been waiting years, but it was finished. Edmond was the author of Villefort's misfortune, and the debt was finally paid. Edmond stood with a sneer, but instead of the groveling or the crying he expected, Villefort grabbed his wrist and led him from the room, back downstairs, to Edward. Here you go, Edmond Dantes. Are you avenged now? Edmond's jaw dropped as he looked on Villefort, clutching the dead body of little Edward, weeping. Then Villefort gasped and ran from the room. He remembered something downstairs. Edmond looked at the bodies of Edward and Madame de Villefort. 5 drops. It had come from the vial he had given her after their second meeting. 5 drops would kill someone, but she had drained the whole bottle in the glasses she and Edward had drank. There was no saving them. As he looked on the body of the child, Edmund began to wonder if he had gone too far. The pain he had felt had bred pain. Destruction had led to destruction. He sighed. Villefort had suffered almost as much as him. There was something he could do for the man. Edmund left the bodies and looked for Villefort, but he couldn't find him. Finally, he heard a shouting downstairs. From the garden. When Edmund crossed the threshold into the garden, he took his hat in his hands. Villefort had a shovel, and, covered in dirt and sweat, he screamed at the sky, "He's not here!" "You lost a son," Edmund said, "but your daughter, Valentine, she's—" "Oh, I didn't lose him. I will find him," Villefort screamed as he started digging in another spot. "You may pretend he's not here, but I'll find him. I'll dig forever." Later that day, after Edmond and Nordier had left, it would take 5 men to restrain him, but only one to diagnose what had happened to Monsieur de Villefort. Something had changed, and he would spend the rest of his days fighting against his restraints, laughing and ranting about the baby in the garden. A week later, Danglars rode in a carriage through Rome. He was back. He had $6 million in his pocket after cashing in the note with Thompson and French. He had done more with less in the past, and he could go anywhere, change his name, and start over. After all, he was only in his late 40s. Maybe he'd even get remarried. And, hey, Peppino? He shouted to his driver. Where were they going? The hotel's back that way. Why were they passing the catacombs? Peppino didn't answer, but pulled the carriage into a cave. After a few minutes of riding in the dark, Danglars heard a click at the door, which opened to a cave, and Danglars found himself staring right down the barrel of Luigi Vampa's pistol. He was in the lair of the legendary Roman bandit. Vampa wasn't a cruel man, but he also wasn't a simple robber. He didn't want Danglars' money. No, he ransomed people. That was his game. Who would pay millions to rescue Danglars from danger? Danglars thought about it. His wife hated him. His daughter had fled to who knows where, and he had shamed himself in the eyes of his friends. He didn't know. Vampa sighed. Well, that was super sad. He was sure the man had someone, and they would find him. In the meantime, Danglars could stay with them. Rent-free, too. He kicked Danglars into a cell. To help with cost, Danglars would have to pay for the goods and services. Danglars nodded. Absolutely. Actually, could he get some breakfast? And, thinking about the gun, a new pair of pants? Vampa grinned. Absolutely. He tossed Danglars a moldy piece of bread and rested his other hand on his gun. That would be 100,000 francs. Four days later, Danglars was down to just 50,000 from his 6 million, and on the floor, weeping and begging his jailers. A tall one appeared at his cell, as Danglars cried that no one had suffered more than him. The voice laughed. There have been those who died of hunger, so that wasn't the case. Do you repent? The voice boomed. Danglars laughed. Of what? He was a prisoner here. He was the wrong party. This was followed by a long silence, as Danglars thought about his life and conceded. Yes, I repent, he said from his huddled ball on the floor. Then I forgive you, the voice boomed and dropped his cloak. I was the one you dishonored, whose betrothed you prostituted, the one you trampled so you might raise yourself to fortune. I am he whose father you condemned to die of hunger. I am he whom you condemned to prison. And yet, I forgive you, because I hope to be forgiven. Edmund, Danglars managed, before collapsing again into a pile of tears. He was sorry. He was so sorry. Edmund looked down at his former friend and shipmate with a sad smile. He repeated, once again, that he forgave the man. The next morning, Danglars woke up next to a stream in a field just outside the city. In his coat pocket were 50,000 francs, all that was left of his 6 million. He bent over the stream to wash dirt from his hands, and when he did, he no longer recognized the face staring back at him. His hair had turned white from the terror of Vampa's prison, and he looked as if he had aged 20 years in a mere 4 days. This one personally always bugged me the most. Danglars orchestrated the plot to send Edmund to prison. He was the mastermind. But now I see it was kind of brilliant, the more I think about it. Danglars wasn't happy as the first mate of the Pharaon, and he wasn't happy as one of the richest, most respected men of Paris. At first glance, it appears to be a kindness that Edmund didn't drive him to madness or suicide. But Danglars was the type of man to carry his misery with him everywhere he went. He hungered for more, not knowing that it not only wouldn't satisfy, but it would continue to bring him pain because, at his heart, he was a broken person. So Edmund let him walk free, knowing that, no matter where he went, he would always be with himself, and that was the worst punishment anyone could give him. You got my letter, Edmund greeted a week later, as he entered his father's old house in Marseille. Mercedes nodded and wiped her eyes. She had recently learned that a count in Paris had taken his own life, and she hadn't stopped crying since. Now, another dead man was standing before her. He wasn't the Count of Monte Cristo anymore, but dressed in the simple clothes of a sailor, the way she remembered him. He looked out the window and told a story. Long ago, a sailor hoped to marry the love of his life, a beautiful Catalan girl. He didn't have much, but what he did have he kept in a lockbox, buried in his garden. It was going to be enough to start a new life together. The couple wouldn't have lived with his father. They had a beautiful, grand life set out for them. But they never had the chance to live that story. It was stolen away, though the dowry remained, and it would be enough to start a new life. For years on end, in the depths of Chateau d'If, Edmund had longed for this moment. Even when days blurred into weeks and months, the thought of Mercedes had kept Edmund looking forward. He imagined himself staring again into Mercedes' eyes as he ran to her. That moment would likely never come, he knew, but it was all he had, and now he was sure that it would never come. The years, the tears, and the lives they had lived created a gulf neither could bridge. They understood each other in a wordless way that only soulmates could, but it was because of their connection that they also knew that they could never be together again. Mercedes had lost the love of her life, twice over, and even though Fernand was horrible, he had never been horrible to her. For all of his faults, he had loved her, and she had loved him. Together, they'd built a life and welcomed another into the world. For a long time, neither said a word. Here they were, at the very end. Mercedes of old was no more, in the same way that Edmond Dantes, the once happy-go-lucky sailor, was also gone. There, standing in his father's house, he realized that when he'd said goodbye to her at their wedding feast, decades ago, it had truly been for the last time. Edmund nodded at Mercedes, and she at him, and he left. To me, the story of the Count of Monte Cristo is about Edmund and Mercedes, the revenge Edmund takes against past wrongs, and his ability to grow past them. But there's more to the ending. A week later, Edmund meets up with Maximilian on the Isle of Monte Cristo, where he offers the young man everything if he would simply not take his own life. Maximilian, still torn up over the death of Valentine, refuses the offer, and instead downs a poison Edmund had prepared. Of course, it isn't really a poison, only a mixture that puts him into a deep sleep. He later wakes, wrapped in Valentine's arms. Edmund, however, has left, leaving all of his property and riches to the young couple. He tries to convince Haydée to stay behind, but she refuses to abandon him. Edmund must then confront a personal truth he's been keeping at bay. He loves Haydée, and she loves him. Together, they can possibly find happiness, even after all they've been through. She leaves with him, and they sail off into the Mediterranean, seeking a better life, free from their pasts. Meanwhile, Maximilian and Valentine sail for the mainland, where Nordier awaits to lead Valentine to the altar. At their wedding ceremony, Maximilian Morel and Valentine Villefort look out on the horizon. He wonders aloud whether they'll ever see Edmond Dantes again, and she replies that they should take his advice. They should do what Edmund did in Chateau d'If those many years, and what he told Maximilian to do while he waited for Valentine. Wait and hope. So I've read this book about 3 times. I read the abridged version in high school, the unabridged after college, and then again this year for the podcast. If you want more details into the story than I provided in our adaptation, by all means go, read the book. You will get more details. You will get all the details. Like, if you want to know more about the travel arrangements of Eugenie Danglars and her piano tutor, and the history of the hotel where they stayed on their way to Belgium, and also the entire backstory of Luigi Vampa, not just the plot relevant points, but all of it. Seriously, the Audible version is 52 hours long. However, as a story, it builds a detailed world, and if you put in the time, it does pay off, and things are consistent and interesting enough that you don't feel like it was time wasted. I do like how Monte Cristo doesn't violently hurt anyone. He uses their own vices against them, and they essentially seal their own fates. He just helps them along. Also, if you're curious, the reason Monte Cristo doesn't tell Maximilian for a few weeks that Valentine isn't actually dead is because he's of the opinion that you can't know true happiness without sorrow. And so Maximilian must go through the darkest time in his life in order to experience the best of the other side. To me, it just seems like an author milking the situation for all the drama possible before Monte Cristo decides to revive Valentine in her tomb, but what do I know? Also, I actually listened to the Audible version long enough to learn that I pronounced nearly all the names incorrectly. Danglars being Danglars, de Villefort being de Villefort, and Nordier being Noirtier, among the most prominent. I learned long ago that you don't change the way you pronounce a character's name mid-story, so thanks for sticking with me if you knew the actual pronunciations. And that's it for Season 3. We hope you enjoyed it. There's plenty more coming your way for Season 4, and make sure you stay subscribed to Fictional between seasons, so you don't miss our bonus episodes. Our old buddies Dante and Virgil are going to pop back onto your feed for their trip through purgatory. You don't want to miss it. We'd love to hear from you on Facebook and Twitter at FictionalPod, and you can find more information at fictional.fm. As always, today's episode was written by me, Jason Weiser, story editor Carissa Weiser, and our theme song's by Breakmaster Cylinder. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. And don't forget about KiwiCo. KiwiCo creates super cool, hands-on projects for kids that make learning about science, technology, engineering, art, and math fun. Kids can create their own arcade games, construct a hydraulic claw, or tinker with electronics and motors. It's awesome. KiwiCo is offering fictional listeners the chance to try them for free. To redeem this offer,